It's time to revise. Welcome back. We're going to crack on with paper 3 today. We're going to have a look at forensic psychology and we're going to be covering offender profiling. So that is the top-down as well as the bottom-up approach. Going to mash it all together today. All right, let's do it. There you go. You got some exam-style questions there. You got timings. Do something active with it. Yeah, give it a go under time conditions if you like. Talk about it, plan it, whatever you want to do. Pause the video though. Yeah, and come back when you're ready for me to talk through. Okay, right, let's do it. So, for 2 marks, we want to talk about what we mean by investigative psychology. Now, investigative psychology is about the application of psychological research and theory to, investigating crime, profiling. You could, to elaborate on this a bit, if it was maybe 2 or I guess maybe even 3 marks, then you could talk about maybe interpersonal coherence or forensic awareness. Yeah, but as I said, it's the application of psychological theory to profiling an offender. Okay, now we want to distinguish between, so we're going to do some comparison here, or the difference between organised and disorganised offenders. And it does tell you this is the top-down approach. Okay, so organised offenders, it's only 2 marks, so just 1 point would be fine. But think about those characteristics. So organised offenders are, maybe socially competent or sexually competent. They tend to have a family. They might have, be married, have children. They might have a highly skilled job. They're likely to be more educated. So you could distinguish in terms of maybe a couple of those characteristics. Whereas when we look at disorganised offenders, they're kind of the opposite. So you tend to see that maybe they live alone, or you might say they're socially or sexually incompetent or less competent. You might say that they typically have lower IQ or a manual or low skilled job in comparison to organised offenders. So yeah, you could talk about the difference between them in terms of their characteristics. I suppose you could, if you wanted to, you could distinguish between the kinds of crime that they're likely to commit or the kind of behaviour that you're going to see at the crime scene. So for example, with an organised offender, you could say that the offender is likely to maybe have planned carefully their crime and maybe brought weapons or brought restraints or brought ways of kind of cleaning up after themselves, that sort of thing. Whereas with the disorganised offenders, you're obviously not going to see those things. So yeah, you could distinguish between them in terms of characteristics or in terms of their likely crime behaviour. All right, now we're going to look at a little bit of application, but there's not really much to go on. But the question really is talking about how the bottom-up approach works in terms of producing a profile of an offender. Now, we've got burglaries committed in a town. We've got maybe a possible link, so there's multiple things going on in terms of these crimes. So what that suggests to me, when I see that and I see bottom-up approach, I'm thinking, we're going to whack them on a map and we're going to talk about geographical profiling possibly. All right? So that's where you could go with it. You could say that the bottom-up approach includes geographical profiling. So what the officers or what the investigators could do is they could produce a map of where these burglaries happened. They could try to use circle theory to draw a circle around them, and the idea being that the offender is likely to live at the centre of that circle. That's where their base of operations is likely to be. So they could bring up or draw up a geographical profile and try to use that spatial information to work out where the offender is operating or where they're even living. Okay, and that might well be enough for 4 marks. But if you wanted to go down the more investigative psychology kind of route, then you could maybe tap into the idea of forensic awareness, and you could maybe say that the investigators or the officers would need to carefully examine the scene of the burglaries and maybe look for evidence of maybe wiping down fingerprints, or maybe they've evidence, maybe they've worn gloves, or they've kind of covered their shoes to get rid of footprints, or whatever else it might be. And that would tell you, because of this idea of forensic awareness, that would tell you that if they've done that, possibly they are someone that has previous experience with the law. Now that might mean that they are educated in police practices. It might just mean that they've already been through the system, so you probably want to look for someone with a history of offending in terms of drawing up that list. Okay, so either or, it's only 4 marks. I don't feel that you need to do all of that. Okay, now I want to discuss a strength of the bottom-up approach to offender profiling. I reckon one thing that we could do here is talk about one strength being that it's kind of based on scientific principles in terms of, we are gathering statistical, we're gathering statistics and we're doing statistical analysis using computer software to, draw links between information that we've got about crimes and try to produce, the circle theory or the jeopardy surface, if you're aware of that, kind of the color-coded map of where the offender is likely to be operating. So you could have a discussion about how good that is in terms of being objective, statistics, scientific. But I suppose because this is a discussion, what I'd then do, I think, is try to undermine that by talking about how it's only as good as the data that you put in. Yeah, someone has made that software and an officer has collected that data. So just because it uses data doesn't make it perfect, doesn't make it scientific. Yeah, it's only as good as what you put into it. And therefore maybe it's not actually as objective as it seems at first glance. Yeah. So maybe this isn't actually an amazing strength of the bottom-up approach. Okay, so we're now going to look at an 8 marker. We're probably looking here at maybe 3 plus 5, but the key point being it's knowledge plus discussion or evaluation. So in terms of knowledge of the top-down approach, we've already talked about the characteristics of organised and disorganised offenders, so you're going to include that there. You probably want a more general statement about the approach as well, along the lines of, with the top-down approach, you are coming at it with these preconceived ideas or templates and trying to fit the crime or fit the offender to those pre-existing profiles of organised or disorganised. Yeah, so they already exist. That's why it's called top-down. We're bringing those categories to the crime. They already exist. Okay, and as I said, you're then going to talk about the characteristics of each type. In terms of evaluation, for an 8 marker, I normally do 2 evaluation paragraphs. I think I would do one here about the utility of it, or kind of the real-world implications of it. You might be aware of Gary Copson, who's done lots of surveys with officers that are using these kind of techniques. And he found over 80% of officers that are using this said that it was useful and it helped them, and 90% of them would definitely use it again. Now, just as an aside, I'm not sure why we've got an extra kind of 5 or 10% there saying, it wasn't useful, but I would use it again. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So, yes, you could have a discussion paragraph about how it's useful for officers and, it's going to help them do their job. It's going to help track down and apprehend criminals, and that's good for society and kind of all of that stuff. Yeah. You could have a limitation, and you could talk about maybe it's pseudo-scientific. You might be aware of the argument that it's a bit like the Barnum effect. The profiles are often so vague, or like horoscopes, if that helps. The profiles are often so vague they could kind of apply to anybody, and it's a bit of a, oh yes, well we found this profile and we found the right person, but I mean it could have been anybody. Yeah, so it's not really scientific. It's not really that useful, according to that argument. You could also, for an 8 marker, we're pretty much done there, but if you wanted a different point, something else you could discuss is possibly that separating offenders into these 2 distinct profiles doesn't really make much sense, and actually maybe it should be more of a spectrum. Maybe there are more than 2 types, and kind of have that sort of discussion. Yeah. All right. So those are some thoughts on dealing with an 8 marker like that. I suppose you could have the same thing, but with the bottom-up approach, but the structure would be the same. What I've got for you then is a 16 marker, where this time we've got knowledge of the bottom-up approach, and it's not evaluating it, it's actually then 10 marks for comparing it with the top-down approach. All right? So, in terms of knowledge of the bottom-up approach, we're probably going to start with like we did with the top-down one, a general kind of, what is the bottom-up approach, and then we're going to pick apart the key concepts and explain those. So the bottom-up approach, I would summarise as saying, it's an approach to offender profiling where it's data-driven and it uses, software, or it uses statistical techniques to try to come up with the profile or the characteristics. Okay, but the key point being it's data-driven or it's evidence-based, something like that. Okay, and then I would go into the 2 key strands of the bottom-up approach. I'm going to explain investigative psychology, which you went through earlier on. You could say about forensic awareness and how, judging from, if they've tried to hide evidence or anything, then that shows there is maybe some previous experience with offending. You could talk about smallest space analysis. You could talk about interpersonal coherence. You don't have to do all of this, but that's the investigative psychology strand. And then Possibly go on and talk about the other key element, which is the geographical profiling. We talked about that earlier. That's your circle theory with your marauders and your commuters, and it's your Jeopardy service, your Rosmo's idea of the criminal geographic targeting system, that colourful map that you can get. Okay, as I said, you don't have to include all of that. I think if you're starting off with a general kind of definition of the bottom-up approach, and then you're going on to talk about maybe a couple of points for investigative and a couple of points with geographical, I think you're golden as long as your terminology is all there, okay, and you're explaining what those things are. Anyway, for comparison, this could be quite tricky, but the kind of things that you might want to think about comparing them on, how scientific are they? Yeah, and in those comparison paragraphs, you're kind of saying, maybe one difference between the top-down and bottom-up approach is how scientific they are. And you're saying, the bottom-up does this, it's using statistics, it's using software, it's evidence-based, all that sort of thing. And then you're doing your comparative language, so whereas the top-down approach doesn't do that, and maybe talk about how it's more based on intuition, and the categories already exist, they don't kind of, emerge from the evidence. And you could, to try and develop this and really stretch out this comparison and do a bit more kind of discussion with it. After you've done each side of it, you could then kind of develop the paragraph and talk about maybe which one's better. And you could say, well, because the bottom-up approach uses this more kind of data-driven and statistical way of profiling, maybe it's the more objective, it's the more credible approach to profiling. So maybe that's the one that should be used more. Yeah. Okay, so that's what I tend to do to level up comparison. So you're kind of doing, what does this thing do? What does this thing do? And then, what are the implications of that discussion? Okay, so that's one point, talk about scientific. You can have a discussion about how useful they are. And actually, the evidence says that officers find both useful. So you could do that as a similarity. You could have a discussion about, do they apply to all kinds of crime? So the bottom-up approach seems to apply to a wider range of crime, whereas the top-down approach is a bit more kind of violent or sexual crime, so you could have a discussion about that. And then I suppose you could do a paragraph on the extent to which they're supported by research if you wanted a fourth point, although you might not have to really if you've done the rest of what I've said. And you could say maybe a similarity is that there is research to support them, and maybe you could talk about the work of David Cantor and whatever else you've studied, but bring it back together and say maybe despite their differences, it's clear that both do have some research support, and do it that way maybe. So there's a good 3 or 4 comparison paragraphs that you could come up with there. Okay. So, time to reflect. How did that go for you? And why did it go that way? How's that going to feed in to your ongoing work? What do you need to do more of? What do you need to do less of? Right, that was me discussing approaches to offender profiling for forensic psychology. We talked about the bottom-up and the top-down approach to profiling. Right, thank you very much. I hope that was useful for you. Keep going. I'll see you in another video. Bish bash bosh.